Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, the pandemic decimates millions of jobs and pushes many into extreme poverty. Could a green recovery be the solution to saving the global economy? Flag of convenience, Chinese ships and crews but flying the Senegalese flag. Local fishermen say the waters off the coast are being overfished. Slaughterhouses are hotspots for COVID-19. Activist investors say that meat processing plants could be the cause of the next pandemic. The coronavirus pandemic has had a devastating impact on the global economy. It's pushed back global efforts to reduce poverty, improve livelihoods and healthcare. Now, understandably, nations have poured billions into shoring up health services, but the recovery, now that lockdowns are being lifted, needs to take into consideration our other global emergency, climate change. With temperatures hitting 100 degrees Fahrenheit in Siberia and the Arctic Circle, the challenge couldn't be more dire. Let's put this into perspective, because we can tackle poverty, job creation and climate change at the same time. To limit rising temperatures to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, $2.4 trillion a year needs to be spent on energy systems around the world until 2035. That's around 2.5% of the world's economy, the UN says. The money is there because the International Monetary Fund says that governments have spent $10 trillion in responding to the pandemic, but more is needed. Despite that, it's estimated that up to 100 million people have been pushed into extreme poverty. The IMF says that further spending should focus on minimizing job losses and preventing a rise in inequality. Many nations are turning their attention to the recovery. The European Union has set aside 750 billion euros for its recovery fund, of which 25% is to be used for climate action. We have two stories for you on poverty and jobs in a green economy. In a moment, Al Jazeera's Nicola Gage reports on how geopolitical tensions are putting pressure on the Australian government to invest in renewable energy as it recovers from the pandemic. But first, a story that's familiar in advanced and poor nations alike. Up to 12 million Mexicans are estimated to have dropped out of the workforce due to the pandemic. Many are in danger of falling into extreme poverty. Al Jazeera's John Holman reports now from Mexico City.
The Guevaras are exhausted after an all-day search for food. If you want to see how COVID's affecting the poorest in Mexico, they invite you to the two rooms this family of 8 share.
We start at 10 a.m. and come home at midnight, just looking for food, where we can get milk, nappies, enough for all of us.
Before the pandemic, Nicolas had a job as a security guard and Nancy sold sweets in a market. Between them, they could feed the family. But that's all gone, Nancy told us when we first met her at a soup kitchen.
Since the start of the pandemic, from March, we haven't had work, and my 2 little ones, my mum and my baby, depend on me, so I have to deal with it.
This donated food is the only reason they're not starving. They're not alone. The country's development agency says the pandemic could tip more than 10 million into extreme poverty, and it's already happening. We went to 16 soup kitchens across the capital. All of them told us that lines have grown. Many said they're serving 3 or 4 times more meals than before. What we found coming to these soup kitchens is that there's a lot of people here from the informal sector, street vendors, rubbish collectors, market workers, people that were already poor, and this has just tipped them over the edge. Even as the need has increased, the number of soup kitchens themselves has fallen. Those turning out to feed people, like Father Benito, run risks.
Because of the pandemic, several kitchens closed down. And so people said to us, please don't close too. If you do, where are we going to go?
It's a salient question. Poverty experts told us that the federal government's aid programs don't really work for those in the informal sector, like Nancy, who often lack IDs and can't prove that they've lost their jobs. She's grateful for what she does get from charitable soup kitchens. She cleans toilets in one to try and pay a little back. By the end of the day, the family's eating. The battle's won. Tomorrow, they'll join the queues again. John Holman, Al Jazeera, Mexico City.
Inside this workshop in the city of Wollongong, large industrial gearboxes are being made and repaired. Most are for the mining sector, but recently the business has turned to renewables, also fixing wind turbines. It now makes up 10% of the company's repair work, and that's expected to double in the next 4 years.
For us, we see renewables as an important part of the Australian industry. We know it's growing and we want to be there to support it.
Coal and steelmaking have defined Wollongong for more than a century, but the focus is quickly shifting to cleaner technologies, including the potential of building components for wind and solar and making cleaner steels. But Australia doesn't have a national climate or energy policy, and union leader Arthur Rorris says that's slowing investment.
What we have in this country is a policy vacuum, and it's letting down our environment as much as it's letting down our coal miners.
While the use of renewable energy is rising, Australia remains one of the world's biggest exporters of thermal coal, and mines are being expanded.
The coal industry employs about 3,000 people here locally and thousands across Australia. Some experts believe that using renewable hydrogen to produce so-called green steel is the most competitive option in the future to replace some of those jobs in coal as demand for carbon products falls.
That's still some years away, but there is huge debate about whether Australia's post-coronavirus economic recovery should be powered by clean technologies. That would need government support.
What it's showing is that renewables can play a meaningful role in providing alternative employment, but only within a wider industry development plan that diversifies these regions into a range of different industries.
COVID-19 has cut demand for coal, forcing down prices. There are also reports that some Chinese power plants have been told to stop importing Australian coal as trade tensions escalate. With a large-scale switch to renewables now inevitable, pressure is growing for the creation of an energy policy to invest in projects that can protect jobs and the environment. Nicola Gage, Al Jazeera, in the city of Wollongong.
Well, that's two case studies of what's happening on the ground right now. How we deal with that is a challenge that nations are trying to get to grips with, and many are exploring green financing as a means to tackle poverty and unemployment. But money isn't too much of an issue for rich nations. But what about some of the poorer parts of the world? Delighted to be joined on Counting the Cost by Sanda Ojiambo, who's Executive Director of the United Nations Global Compact, the world's largest sustainability-focused organisation. Sanda, you work with something around 10,000 companies around the world, many of them in various states of financial health at the moment. Some are using government bailouts to support jobs, but are they in a position, given all of that, to push ahead with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which range from poverty reduction to climate change?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to talk about this really important topic. You are right. I think the COVID era has pushed many economies into the state where they do need to rely on government bailouts. And this is happening both in the developed as well as the developing world. Now, actually just 2 days ago, I did a sort of tour de table with all our members around the local networks. You're right, over 10,000 companies participate in the UN Global Compact, and they are at various stages of need in terms of economic support. I think what is very important is that we do need to really start stimulating economies to be able to allow businesses to build back and build back better. Of concern, really, I think, is perhaps more the medium and the small enterprise sectors, because statistics have shown that globally, most of these companies have not been able to survive through the COVID pandemic, resulting in job losses and obviously huge income losses as well. And so it's a fine balance between pivoting, innovating around the businesses that you perhaps already did, working along with other companies to grow, but also being open to be able to receive economic stimulus packages in whichever ways and shapes that they do come from government.
But how long are governments going to be expected to dip into their pockets and make bailouts, loans, grants like this? I mean, that's pretty easy for developed nations to keep doing. But what about developing nations? There have been calls from Ethiopia's Prime Minister for $100 billion in economic stimulus from the G20. Now, the G20 has offered a debt holiday, but I mean, that's not going to get them very far, is it?
No, you're right. I mean, I think, this economic recovery program that we need to go through is going to be multifaceted. I think if you look at the other end of the continuum, shifting away from just the government, I think banks and financiers and credit institutions also need to look at what sort of, either facilities or moratoriums they can give, especially to small businesses who often really are not part of the largely banked sector or those who can easily access credit and credit financing. I think suppliers need to look at what they can do in terms of allowing some sort of flexibility. Supply chains also need to be open and flexible. So I think, I agree there is huge amounts of money that governments probably need to set aside if they're looking at stimulating economies as a whole. But I think this consideration needs to trickle down at various levels of the economy. It's really what we're talking about, building inclusive business, right from the ground up. And I think, a match between private sector financing, public sector financing, and some innovation to really look at what products and services are truly needed right now to drive economies forward. I think in all of our countries, we've seen a massive resurgence of e-commerce and the opportunities that e-commerce and mobile payments and technology has brought to drive economies forward. I think it's also an opportunity for businesses to stop, innovate, think around what they can do, and also look at the business opportunities that, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals will afford to them. We've seen a lot of businesses shift production lines and go into perhaps working on health products. We've seen a lot of businesses shifting to look at more innovations around agriculture and education. So I think, it will take an amount of financing, but also there is the opportunity to recreate what business looks like for the future.
Is there a need for a Marshall Fund for a green recovery globally?
One of the things, often when we look at COVID, we look at the things that haven't gone so well and where there's been destruction, perhaps decimation. But as we all know, I think climate and the reduced pressure on economic activity has actually provided some big wins for climate. And I do think it is time to look at financing that supports proper green growth, proper inclusive growth, green jobs. It's a great opportunity to refocus on what we at the Global Compact, as well as within the UN, are pushing, which is really a target 1.5 degrees maximum level of temperature growth, to really minimize what could be the catastrophic impacts of climate change. If we can grow back in a way that really supports mitigation of climate change, I think it will be a fantastic way to rebuild the economy in the post-COVID era.
The world's already way behind meeting its 2030 development goals. Are we going to miss that target now? Is there no way we can catch up again?
So Secretary General Guterres did articulate the clear call to action for the decade of action, solid action to drive forward the SDGs for the next 10 years. And I agree, COVID has created some setbacks, but on the other hand, it's also created a few opportunities for us to refocus on the Sustainable Development Goals as the way forward. I think it will take concerted action, first of all, from governments to really commit to driving the SDGs forward and providing an enabling environment for both civil society as well as business to really operate in a way that maximizes the potential and opportunities of the SDGs. Businesses also need to relook at how incorporating the SDGs into their business strategies and not their philanthropic strategies, but into their core business strategies provides opportunities. And then, of course, in the small and medium sector, there's lots of opportunities to innovate and drive products and services. This is really what is at the heart of the work of the UN Global Compact. We work with companies around the world to help them integrate the Sustainable Development Goals into their business strategies and drive business benefit as well as societal and development outcomes.
Sandra, it's been really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
China has agreed to defer debt repayments from cash-strapped African nations like Senegal that have struggled during the pandemic. Now, Senegal is more than $1 billion in debt to Beijing and has awarded deep-sea fishing licenses to the Chinese government. That's drawn criticism from local fishermen and environmentalists who say that the waters are already overfished. Al Jazeera's Nicholas Huck reports from Dhaka.
They're back. Tired and hungry after weeks at sea, unloading their meager catch in West Africa's biggest artisanal fishing port. Deep in the ocean, they say, are unmarked vessels carrying tons of fish. Usman Fai describes it as a stolen treasure, a catch he can only dream of.
The ocean isn't like it used to be. There aren't as many fish, and there are too many boats in Senegalese waters depleting our fish stocks.
The Senegalese Fishing Union accuses the government of favoring Chinese vessels instead of protecting local fishermen. With the help of Senegalese authorities, Chinese vessels have been allowed to change their flag to the Senegalese one in order to fish the country's territorial waters. Sunumar is a vessel that sailed all the way from China to the western coast of Africa.
We export to China and to the region. We are a Senegalese company, but Chinese run, so we can ship in Senegal. There's no problem.
China relies on Senegalese fish to feed its population of 1.4 billion people. Indebted and cash-strapped, Senegal needs Chinese money.
We have no agreement with the Chinese government. There are some Chinese fishing vessels, but why aren't you asking me questions about the European vessels? Why stigmatize the Chinese? They have their interest and we have ours. And they are an important partner to Senegal.
Senegal owes billions of dollars to China. With the economy stalling because of the coronavirus outbreak, people are going hungry. President Macky Sall has been calling for African debt to be cancelled in order to deal with what the UN describes as a looming food crisis. China agreed to delay debt repayments.
Most of the fishing vessels in the port of Dakar are Chinese, and this crew is getting ready to sail out at sea. Out of sight, in Senegalese territorial waters, are deep sea trawlers fishing illegally and destroying the environment.
Greenpeace describes these Chinese fishing vessels as floating factories. They are no match to Fai's boats. Scientists predict that within a decade, ocean ecosystems will collapse because of rising temperatures and overfishing. Despite this threat, it seems for now, the Chinese are here to stay. Nicholas Hawke, Al Jazeera, Dakar.
More than 29,000 American meat workers have been infected with COVID-19 and 238 have died, according to the unions. The United Food and Commercial Workers International Union has called on the president to do more to protect workers. Cold, damp and overcrowded, slaughterhouses and meatpacking plants are the perfect breeding grounds for the virus. This isn't just a problem for the United States. Meat processing plants in Europe have been forced to close, prompting localized lockdowns. And China has banned the import of pork from the Netherlands. Now, a $20 trillion network of investment funds is warning that the meat industry is at serious risk of creating and spreading a future pandemic. FAIR is also challenging the meat industry to reduce the use of antibiotics to prevent antibiotic-resistant superbugs causing the next pandemic. Last month, I caught up with the director of FAIR, Maria Latini, and began by asking, as someone who's been fighting and challenging meat producers to change their working practices for some time, is the message finally getting through?
Well, and I'd actually like to say that COVID isn't really the first zoonotic disease that has been upon us, right? I mean, several years ago, maybe you or your family had swine flu or bird flu here in London. I know my kids did. So, I mean, we've been talking to the meat companies now for years, right? So bird flu, swine flu, Nipah virus, Ebola. And I think what's happened is the COVID virus has really created a perfect storm. So there's no way these meat companies can't sit up and listen now.
So what do meat processors need to do in order to avoid the spread of disease?
Well, I think meat processors know what they need to do, frankly. And, now that they've had over 20,000 illnesses and deaths, I think they need to start putting that into practice, right? Investors have been engaging very much on this issue over the past 3 months. And so protocols need to be put in place, right? We need good PPE for workers. We need to try and institute some social distancing. I mean, if you think about a slaughter line right now, you have workers side by side, elbow to elbow, working on slaughtering these animals, right? So there's poor ventilation. They need proper PPE to protect themselves. They need plastic separations. And frankly, there needs some daily testing, assessment, and surveillance, and the opportunity to visit medical staff, and the opportunity to also stay at home if they feel ill or sick or unsure about coming to work.
All of that is going to cost money, of course, which is going to impact the end price of the product. Who's going to pay for that? Us, the consumer, I suppose.
I mean, I think what I've been saying for a while now is, you know, if something seems too good to be true, maybe it is too good to be true. And, you know, when you think about a Big Mac costs 99 cents, I think we need to start reflecting on if that should be the fair price. So I think the entire industry is going to have to absorb some of this cost, and you know, consumers should be ready to absorb it too. I don't think any consumer now, particularly after their understanding of these essential workers on the front line, wouldn't be willing to pay a few extra cents for their Big Mac in order to not have the lives of workers, families, and communities being at risk just to have their Big Mac or their chicken nuggets.
How then do investors and groups like yours challenge the giants of the food industry, like Tyson Foods in the US, where the family owns all the Class B shares, meaning that even if all the other shareholders voted against the family, they'd still win?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's time for these companies to stand up and be leaders, and, you know, setting out what change and resilience looks like. So, you know, if John Tyson, the chairman of Tyson Foods, takes out a full-page ad in the Washington Post and the New York Times saying the food system is breaking, that's a pretty big statement. And I think we'd all want to say, okay, John, your company has been, and your family has been in this industry for 70 or 80 years. How would you suggest that we change protocols and that we look at this industry and set out a path to resilience for food safety and food security? So investors have been engaging on a number of issues that we've been speaking about in our new report, whether it be deforestation, food safety, working conditions, overuse of antibiotics, biosecurity issues in general. And I don't think any of those come as a surprise to the companies that we're talking to. So now I think it's just time for industry, companies, and investors to work together to set out a path for how we want to see this industry change.
Maria, it's been really great to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, what do you do if inflation soars more than 700%? Well, some people would obviously want to protect their money by investing in the stock market. That's what happened in Zimbabwe, but the government has halted trading. Al Jazeera's Harun Mutasa reports.
Zimbabwe Stock Exchange is closed for business until further notice. Staff are on the premises, but no trading is allowed. The sudden move has left stockbrokers and economists struggling to explain to investors what exactly is going on.
The foreign investor simply says, I can see a massive reduction now coming in the investment capital I brought to the country in good faith. And I was told at the time that if I wanted to liquidate those assets, I could take the money out of the country. Now, all of those promises are not being kept, and they see nothing but uncertainty.
Government officials say they suspect mobile money was being used to buy shares, and then that money was moved out of the country, sabotaging the economy. They say they want to stabilize the local currency, which is drastically devalued since its reintroduction last year after a decade of dollarization.
So what you saw was a regulatory intervention to investigate, try to understand the prima facie evidence, or need to confirm it, that suddenly there was some, suspicion of illicit financial movements, including money laundering. But these need to be proven.
President Emmerson Mnangagwa, who succeeded longtime ruler Robert Mugabe in 2017 after a military coup, is blaming the private sector, opposition groups, and some Western countries for Zimbabwe's economic crisis. Zimbabwe has struggled to stabilize its local currency since reintroducing it last year. The Zimbabwe dollar keeps devaluing. Inflation is nearly 800%, the highest rate in a decade. That's why investors with cash prefer buying shares to avoid their money losing value. Economists say suspending most mobile money transactions in a country with a serious shortage of banknotes is problematic. People can still pay utility bills and goods, but the number of transactions per day are limited. As shortages of food, fuel and cash persist, government workers are threatening to strike if they are not paid in American dollars. They say the Zimbabwe dollar is devaluing too fast, and more people and businesses don't want to use it. Haru Mutasa, Al Jazeera, Harare.
And that's our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've seen, you can tweet me. I'm at @Finnegan on Twitter. Please use the hashtag AJCTC when you can do, or you can drop us a line. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find individual reports, links, even entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.